What happens when innocence is met with suspicion? When a boy's soul poured out through the strings of a violin is seen not as a gift, but as a threat. In the heart of Boston, a 14-year-old's melody charmed a bustling crowd, his talent a beacon of pure light. But when the piercing wail of sirens sliced through his song, and a circle of blue uniforms closed in that light, was nearly extinguished. The crowd held its breath, witnessing what they thought was another tragic headline in the making. They were wrong. They were about to discover the heart-stopping truth of who this boy was playing for, a truth that would unleash a storm of justice nobody saw coming. The heart of Boston pulsed with the rhythm of 1,000 lives on that crisp autumn afternoon. Quincy Market, a historical labyrinth of food stalls, artisan shops, and cobblestone promenades, was a symphony of human experience. The air thick with the scent of grilling sausages and sweet cinnamon mingled with the salty tang of the nearby harbor. Tourists and locals swirled in a chaotic, vibrant dance, their chatter a constant humming bass line to the city's melody. Cutting through this cacophony, sharp and pure as a shard of crystal, was another sound. It was a violin, and it wasn't just being played. It was weeping, soaring, telling a story without words. The musician was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 14. Leo Washington stood near the statue of Samuel Adams, his slight frame dwarfed by the bronze patriot. He was a study in contrasts. His worn sneakers were planted firmly on the centuries-old stones, but his eyes were closed, lost in a world of his own making. His fingers, long and impossibly nimble, danced across the fingerboard of a violin that had seen better days. The varnish was chipped, the wood scarred, but in his hands it sang with the voice of an angel. He was playing Massenet's Meditation from the opera Thais, a piece of such profound, aching beauty that it seemed to physically alter the space around it. The melody, a tender, melancholic prayer, floated above the market's din, weaving its way into the hearts of those who passed by. Slowly, almost unconsciously, a crowd began to form. It started with a trickle. A woman in a business suit, her phone pressed to her ear, paused mid-sentence, her conversation forgotten. A group of college students, loud and boisterous, quieted down their laughter, fading as they turned towards the music. A grizzled construction worker, his face a mask of weary cynicism, stopped, his hard hat in his hands, a flicker of something soft in his eyes. Leo was oblivious. He was not performing for them. He was simply sharing a piece of his soul. The music was his sanctuary, the violin his voice. In a life that was often a dissonant jumble of challenges, here in the embrace of these 4 strings, he found harmony. He played, and the world outside the reach of his bow ceased to exist. His open violin case lay at his feet, its velvet lining faded to a pale purple. A few dollars and some loose change were scattered inside offerings from those who had been touched by his impromptu concert. But the size of the crowd was growing far beyond the modest donations. It was a diverse mosaic of Boston itself, black, white, Asian, Hispanic, young, old, rich, poor. They stood in a silent, reverent semicircle, united by the universal language of his music. They saw a boy, gifted and passionate, sharing his art with the world. That, however, was not what Officer Flannery saw. Officer Dave Flannery was a man who saw the world in black and white, and more often than not, he saw the black as a potential problem. He was 10 years on the force, his idealism long since eroded by the daily grind of petty crime and human misery. He walked his beat with a heavy tread and a permanent scowl etched onto his face. His partner, Officer O'Malley, was younger, greener, and still possessed a semblance of the community policing spirit they were taught at the academy. They were making their regular patrol through the market, when the sound of the violin reached them. O'Malley's first thought was, "Wow, that's beautiful." Flannery's was, "What's the grift?" He saw a black kid in worn clothes with an open case drawing a crowd. In his jaded mind, the equation was simple public gathering, unsolicited performance, money changing hands. It was panhandling, plain and simple, a public nuisance. He didn't hear the sublime artistry of Massenet. He heard a violation of City Ordinance 16-12-28. "Let's go check this out." Flannery grunted, his hand instinctively going to his belt. O'Malley hesitated. "He's just playing a violin, Dave. Look at all these people. They're loving it." "They're blocking the walkway," Flannery retorted, his eyes narrowing. "It's a public safety issue, and he needs a permit to perform here. You think this kid's got a permit?" The question was rhetorical, laced with derision. As the two uniformed officers began to walk towards Leo, a subtle shift occurred in the atmosphere. The spell was broken. The crowd, which had been a single entity united in appreciation, now became a collection of individuals. Their awareness sharpened their focus, shifting from the music to the approaching police. A ripple of apprehension went through them. The air, once filled with melody, now crackled with a new, unwelcome tension. Leo, his eyes still closed, reached the crescendo of the piece. The notes climbed higher and higher, a passionate, pleading cry that hung in the air for a breath, then faded into a whisper-soft resolution. He held the final note, letting it dissolve into the city's hum, a perfect, poignant silence. It was in that silence that he finally opened his eyes, and the first thing he saw was not the captivated faces of his audience, not the scattered dollars in his case. He saw the polished black boots, the navy blue trousers, and the stern, unimpressed face of Officer Flannery, looking down at him. The officer's shadow fell over him, a sudden, chilling eclipse that blocked out the warmth of the afternoon sun. The beautiful world of music he had built around himself came crashing down, replaced by a stark, familiar fear. The symphony of Quincy Market had just acquired a new, ominous movement. "All right, son, that's enough." Flannery's voice was a flat, authoritative thud, utterly devoid of the warmth that had filled the space moments before. "Show's over. Pack it up." Leo froze, his bow still hovering over the strings. The transition was too jarring, too sudden. One moment, he was in a sacred space of melody and emotion. The next, he was just a kid being told to move along. His heart, which had been soaring with the music, was now a frantic drum against his ribs. O'Malley, standing slightly behind his partner, offered a less confrontational tone. "You got a permit to perform here, kid?" Leo swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. A permit," he stammered. The concept was foreign. He wasn't a performer, not in the official sense. He was just Leo. He played because he had to, because the music was a pressure inside him that needed to be released. I didn't know I needed one. I'm just playing." "You've got an open case, and you're collecting money." Flannery pointed a thick finger at the worn case. "That's soliciting, in this city that requires a permit. You got one or not?" The question was an accusation. "No, sir." Leo said, his voice barely a whisper. He started to lower his violin, a deep sense of shame washing over him. He felt as though he'd done something wrong, though he couldn't understand what. The crowd, however, was beginning to find its voice. The initial apprehension was curdling into quiet anger. "Hey, leave him alone," a woman in a Red Sox cap called out. "He wasn't bothering anybody." "He was making the whole day better," another man added, his arms crossed over his chest. Flannery's head snapped towards the voices, his eyes flashing with irritation. "Folks, this is official police business. Disperse. Clear the walkway." His command had the opposite effect. Instead of dispersing, the crowd seemed to press in closer, their bodies forming a protective if unspoken barrier around Leo. They had been his audience, and now they were becoming his guardians. This subtle defiance was all Flannery needed. He saw it not as community support for a young artist, but as a challenge to his authority. The situation was escalating, and in his mind, that required a show of force. He reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is 2 King 14. We've got a public disturbance at Quincy Market. Unlicensed performer. Hostile crowd forming. Requesting backup." O'Malley shot him a look of disbelief. "Backup, Dave. It's one kidded with a violin. Let's just give him a warning and have him move on." It stopped being about the kid the second they started chirping. Flannery hissed back, his gaze sweeping over the crowd with contempt. "We don't let them dictate how we do our job." Within minutes, the distant wail of sirens began to cut through the air, growing steadily louder. It was a sound that signaled emergencies, fires, and violent crimes. To hear it summoned for a boy playing music felt like a grotesque overreaction. A second police cruiser pulled up at the edge of the market, its lights flashing, painting the historic brickwork in frantic strokes of red and blue. Then a third. The arrival of more cars and more uniforms transformed the scene entirely. The last vestiges of a peaceful afternoon concert were obliterated. This was now a confrontation. The market-goers, who had been on the periphery, now stopped, their curiosity piqued by the disproportionate police presence. Phones began to emerge from pockets, their small lenses pointing towards the center of the drama. Among them was Sarah Chen, a junior associate at a downtown law firm. She had been grabbing a lobster roll for a late lunch when the violin music had drawn her in. Now her legal instincts were screaming. She saw a young black boy, no obvious threat, being encircled by a growing number of police officers. She saw a clear case of escalation of potential profiling. She tapped the record button on her phone, her hand steady, her face a mask of focused intensity. A few feet away, Ben Carter, a reporter for a local online news outlet, watched with a more cynical eye. He had been chasing a lead on a city council scandal. But this had potential. It had the visuals, the conflict, the potent, ever-present narrative of race and policing. He began snapping photos, his mind already composing headlines. Teen musician silenced by police. Or perhaps something more inflammatory. It was a story, and his job was to find stories. As the two new officers joined Flannery and O'Malley, a distinct formation began to take shape. They didn't just stand there. They positioned themselves, creating a loose but unmistakable circle around Leo. It was a tactic of intimidation and control designed to isolate a subject from the crowd. To Leo, it felt like the world was shrinking, the circle of blue uniforms, a tightening noose. The faces of the crowd were now obscured by the bodies of the officers. He could hear their murmurs, their shouts of protest, but they seemed to be coming from a great distance. His world had been reduced to this small, terrifying space. His breath came in shallow gasps. His hands, which had been so fluid and graceful on the violin just moments ago, were now trembling. He clutched the neck of his violin, the smooth, worn wood, a familiar anchor in a sea of fear. It was all he had. In that moment of rising panic, an instinct took over, a message from a deeper part of his being. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory, a warm, reassuring rumble from years past. "When words fail you, son," he had always said, "let the music speak. It speaks a language everyone understands." With trembling hands, Leo raised the violin back to his shoulder. He took a shaky breath, closed his eyes again, and drew his bow across the strings. It wasn't a piece of classical music this time. It was a simple, soulful melody, a blues riff his grandfather had taught him. It was a sound born not of concert halls, but of back porches and late-night jam sessions. It was a sound of resilience, of sorrow, of a spirit that refused to be broken. The music was his only shield, his only defiance. And as the circle of officers stood around him, their faces hard and unyielding, the boy played on his violin, crying out into the chaos. The bluesy, defiant notes from Leo's violin sliced through the tension, a stark contrast to the sterile authority of the police. It was an act of courage that the crowd immediately recognized, and their murmurs grew into shouts. "He's a child! What did he do? This is harassment!" The arriving backup included Sergeant Frank Miller. Miller was a cop from a bygone era, a man carved from granite and cynicism. He had 25 years on the force, a back that ached with every step, and a belief that the only way to handle any situation was with overwhelming, unquestionable authority. He saw the world as a constant battle between order and chaos, and he was one of the few good soldiers left holding the line. He stepped out of his cruiser, his eyes small and hard like ball bearings, taking in the scene with a practiced, dismissive sweep. He saw a crowd he considered a mob, a kid he considered a punk, and officers he considered to be losing control. "What the hell is going on here, Flannery?" Miller's voice was a low growl that cut through the noise. "Sergeant," Flannery said, relieved to pass the baton of command. "We got an unlicensed performer here. Kids refusing to comply, and the crowd's getting hostile." Refusing to comply. Miller looked at Leo, who was still playing. His eyes squeezed shut as if to block out the world. To Miller, this wasn't a terrified boy seeking refuge in his music. It was a blatant act of disrespect. It was a challenge. He pushed through the other officers, his presence immediately commanding the space. He stood directly in front of Leo, so close that the boy could feel the heat radiating from his body. "I said that's enough," Miller barked, his voice a percussive blast that made Leo flinch, his bow skittering across the strings in a screech of dissonance. Leo's eyes snapped open. He stopped playing. The sudden silence was deafening. All he could see was the sergeant's face, a mask of pure, undiluted anger. "You will stop playing that thing," Miller said, his words slow and deliberate, each one a hammer blow. "You will put it in its case, and you will show me your identification and your permit to perform. Now." Leo's mind was a whirlwind of fear. Permit. ID. He didn't have a permit. His school ID was in his backpack, which was at home. He felt a wave of nausea. He wanted to explain, to apologize, to make them understand. But the words were stuck in his throat, a tangled knot of panic. As the sergeant's glare bore down on him, his mind retreated, seeking safety and memory. A different face appeared in his thoughts, the kind, wrinkled face of his grandfather, Marcus. Leo is 8 years old, sitting on the porch of his grandfather's small house in Roxbury. His hands are clumsy, his first violin, a half-size rental, feels awkward and alien. He's producing a sound like a tortured cat. He wants to quit. Marcus sits beside him, not scolding but smiling. "It ain't about making it sound pretty right away, Leo," he says, his voice a gentle rasp. "It's about letting it talk for you. Right now, it's saying you're frustrated. That's an honest sound. You keep working, and one day, it'll say you're happy. It'll say you're sad. It'll say everything you can't find the words for. This here," he taps the body of the violin, "this is your bridge. It can take you anywhere you want to go. and it can connect you to anyone, no matter who they are. The memory was a small, warm light in the cold darkness of the present. A bridge. He needed a bridge now more than ever. His gaze flickered past the sergeant to his violin case. Inside, tucked into a side pocket, was the dog-eared program from his mother's recital. A year ago. A small community church hall, stuffy and warm. His mother, Ellen, stands on a makeshift stage. She isn't a professional musician. She's a nurse's aide who works double shifts to pay for Leo's lessons at the Boston Arts Academy's youth program. But once a year, the adult student orchestra she belongs to puts on a concert. She plays second violin, her face a picture of intense concentration and pure joy. Leo sits in the front row, his chest swelling with a pride so immense it feels like it might crack his ribs. He sees the exhaustion in her eyes, the permanent fatigue from long hours and little sleep. But he also sees her spirit, her unwavering belief in him, in the power of music to lift them up. After the concert, she hugs him, her hand calloused from work, but her touch gentle. All those extra hours, she whispers, her voice thick with emotion. They're worth it, baby. To see you play, to know you have this gift. It's all worth it. These memories, these pillars of his life, gave him a sliver of strength. He wasn't just a punk. He was Marcus's grandson. He was Elena's son. He was a musician. He found his voice, though it trembled. I don't have a permit, sir. I'm sorry. I can pack up. I can go. You'll go when I tell you to go, Miller snapped. First I want your ID. I don't have it on me, Leo admitted, his voice shrinking again. It's at home. To Miller, this was a classic pattern of evasion. No permit, no ID. The kid was lying, hiding something. The crowd's shouts were getting louder, more pointed. Sarah Chen's phone was still recording a small, unwavering red light. Ben Carter was typing furiously into his own device, live tweeting the confrontation. Boston violin boy, police harassment. So you're an unidentifiable minor causing a public disturbance and refusing to cooperate. Miller summarized, twisting the facts into a narrative that fit his worldview. He turned to O'Malley. Cuff him. The order hung in the air, sharp and unbelievable. Cuff him. O'Malley repeated, his eyes wide. Sergeant, for what? A city ordinance violation. He's a kid. He's a suspect who is refusing to identify himself. Miller shot back his authority, absolute. You have a problem with my order, officer. O'Malley hesitated, his conscience at war with his duty. The crowd erupted. The idea of putting this boy in handcuffs for playing a violin was a spark in a powder keg. Shouts of shame and racists rained down on the officers. Leo looked at the handcuffs O'Malley was reluctantly pulling from his belt. Cold, hard steel. The world tilted on its axis. This couldn't be happening. He thought of his mother, of what this would do to her. He thought of his grandfather, and a wave of fresh grief and desperation washed over him. The standoff had reached its breaking point. Leo was no longer just a boy with a violin. He was a symbol, a flashpoint in a conflict that had been simmering in the city's soul for decades. And Sergeant Miller, blinded by his own rigid code, was about to push it over the edge. As Officer O'Malley took a reluctant step towards Leo, handcuffs in hand, a new voice cut through the clamor. It was a voice accustomed to being heard, calm and resonant, with an effortless authority that had nothing to do with a badge or a uniform. Sergeant, I believe there has been a misunderstanding. The crowd parted, and a man stepped forward. He was in his late 70s, impeccably dressed in a tweed blazer, crisp shirt and ascot. His hair was a distinguished silver, and he leaned lightly on a polished mahogany cane. He moved with an air of quiet confidence, his presence a stark contrast to the raw, aggressive energy of the scene. Sergeant Miller turned his face a thundercloud of annoyance. "And who are you?" he demanded. "My name is Alistair Cromwell," the man said, his tone polite but firm. A ripple of recognition went through the more informed members of the crowd, including Ben Carter, the journalist, whose eyes widened in surprise. Alistair Cromwell was not just some wealthy Bostonian. He was a pillar of the city's cultural and philanthropic community. His family name was etched onto museum wings, university libraries, and most notably, the main patrons' lounge at Symphony Hall. He was the discreet, powerful force behind countless artistic endeavors in the city. "This young man," Cromwell continued, gesturing towards Leo with a graceful wave of his hand, "is not a panhandler. He is a musician of prodigious talent, a true virtuoso. In fact, he is a guest of mine." Miller scoffed a cynical, dismissive sound. "A guest of yours? Here in the middle of Quincy Market?" "Precisely," Cromwell said, his smile never wavering. "I was on my way to a luncheon at the Union Club when I heard the music. I recognized the piece, of course. Massenet. But it was the quality of the playing that stopped me. I have been standing here for 20 minutes, utterly captivated. This boy is playing with a maturity and depth that one rarely encounters even among seasoned professionals." He then looked directly at Leo, and for the first time, a genuine warm smile broke through the boy's fear. Leo knew exactly who Mr. Cromwell was. 6 months earlier. Leo is in a small, sterile audition room at the Boston Arts Academy. He's terrified. He's there for the final round of interviews for the prestigious Cromwell Scholarship, a full-ride program for gifted young musicians from underserved communities. He's played his piece, a complex Bach partita, his hands shaking so much he's sure he messed up every other note. Now he's facing a panel of stern-looking judges. At the center of the panel sits Alistair Cromwell himself. He isn't stern. His eyes are kind, perceptive. He asks Leo not about his technique, but about his passion. "Why do you play, son?" Leo, fumbling for words, says the first thing that comes to his heart. Because when I play, I feel like I can fly, and I want to take everyone with me." Cromwell had smiled then, a genuine, appreciative smile. "A beautiful sentiment," he had said. Leo got the scholarship the next day. The funding was private, the selection process discreet. No one, not even most of his teachers, knew the full extent of Cromwell's personal involvement and patronage. Now back in the market, Cromwell tried to de-escalate the situation. "Sergeant, I can personally vouch for this young man. His name is Leo Washington. He is one of my scholarship recipients. If there is a fine for performing without a permit, I will happily pay it. There is no need for this spectacle." For a moment it seemed like Cromwell's intervention might work. His name carried weight. His calm authority was a soothing balm on the inflamed situation. O'Malley looked at Miller, a pleading expression on his face, silently begging him to take the off-ramp. But Sergeant Miller was not a man easily swayed by tailored blazers and fancy names. In fact, Alistair Cromwell represented everything Frank Miller had grown to despise. Miller's animosity wasn't just a generic class warfare resentment. It was specific, and it was deeply personal. It was a wound that had never healed. 5 years ago, a rainy, slick night in Beacon Hill, the city's wealthiest neighborhood. Miller and his partner Jimmy Riley respond to a silent alarm at a townhouse. It's the home of a tech billionaire. They enter guns drawn. What they don't know is that the homeowner has a state-of-the-art and highly illegal European security system, complete with pressure plates and automated defenses. A heavy steel door, triggered by one of their steps, slams down, separating the two officers. Miller hears shouting, a scuffle, a single gunshot. He spends frantic minutes trying to break through the reinforced door. When he finally gets through, he finds Jimmy on the floor, bleeding out from a gunshot wound. The homeowner, a young tech mogul, had panicked, thought they were intruders, and fired his unlicensed gun. The investigation that followed was in Miller's eyes a travesty. The mogul hired a team of the city's most expensive lawyers. Men like Alistair Cromwell, with their influence and connections, wrote letters to the editor defending the homeowner, framing it as a tragic accident, a case of a man defending his home. The tech mogul got a slap on the wrist, a probationary sentence. Jimmy Riley got a funeral with full honors, and his wife became a widow. Miller never forgave them. He never forgave the system that protected the rich and powerful, that allowed a man who killed a cop to walk free while he was left to carry the ghost of his partner every single day. Now, standing in Quincy Market, looking at Alistair Cromwell, all that bitterness, all that unresolved rage came boiling to the surface. He saw the same smug entitlement, the same belief that money and influence could bend the rules. This wasn't just about a kid playing a violin anymore. This was about him, Frank Miller, holding the line against the very people he blamed for the death of his best friend. He looked from Cromwell's serene face to Leo's terrified one, and in his warped perception, they were one and the same two sides of a coin of privilege and defiance he was determined to crush. "I don't care who he is," Miller snarled, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "And I don't care who you are. This is a police matter. I gave an order." He turned his burning gaze back to O'Malley. "I said, cuff him." The challenge was laid down. It was no longer about procedure. It was a raw, personal vendetta playing out in public with a 14-year-old boy and his violin trapped in the crossfire. The twist of Cromwell's arrival hadn't resolved the drama. It had unknowingly poured gasoline on a hidden, smouldering fire. The word "cuff him" echoed in the sudden, tense silence. It was a point of no return. O'Malley, his face pale, took another step forward. The crowd surged a wave of collective disbelief and anger. Sarah Chen's phone remained steady, a silent digital witness. Ben Carter's fingers flew across his screen, his journalistic detachment melting away into something resembling horror. Leo watched the handcuffs approach. They were no longer just an object. They were a symbol of everything he was afraid of. They represented failure, shame, and the crushing weight of a world that saw him not as a boy with a gift, but as a problem to be contained. He thought of his mother's tired face, her sacrifices. He thought of the Cromwell Scholarship, the immense gift he had been given, and the fear that he was about to dishonor it, to lose it all. And then he thought of his grandfather. Not his kind words of wisdom this time, but the reason he wasn't on the porch anymore. The reason his chair sat empty. Grandfather Marcus had passed away 2 weeks ago. A sudden heart attack had stolen him from their lives, leaving a gaping, silent hole. The funeral was tomorrow. A simple one was all they could manage. But even that came with costs they were struggling to meet. His mother had taken on even more shifts, her grief buried under a mountain of exhaustion and worry. Leo hadn't been playing in Quincy Market for pocket money. He wasn't playing for fun. He was playing for his grandfather. Every dollar, every quarter dropped into his case was for the funeral. It was for the simple bouquet of flowers he wanted to place on the casket. It was his own way of contributing, of honoring the man who had given him the world of music. The shame of their poverty, the intimacy of his grief, it was a secret he held close to his heart. As O'Malley reached for his arm, something inside Leo broke. Not his spirit, but the dam holding back his grief, his fear, his desperation. It all came rushing out, not in a shout or a sob, but in the only way he knew how to truly speak. He yanked his arm back, not in aggression, but in a desperate, instinctual retreat. He twisted his body away, raising the violin to his chin in a single fluid motion. He wasn't thinking. He was feeling. And then he played. He didn't play Bach or Massenet. He didn't play the blues. He played a song that every single person in that square, the cops, the crowd, the tourist, the lawyer, the philanthropist, knew in the marrow of their bones. He played Amazing Grace. The first note was a raw, wounded cry, filled with all the pain and terror of the last half hour. It cut through the angry shouts of the crowd, silencing them instantly. It was a sound of such profound, unvarnished anguish that it bypassed the ears and went straight to the heart. Then the melody unfolded. It wasn't the clean, polished version one might hear in a church. This was different. Leo poured every ounce of his being into the music. The notes trembled with his fear, soared with his desperate hope, and wept with his deep, bottomless grief for his grandfather. The music filled Quincy Market, washing over the cobblestones, echoing off the historic brick. It was a sound that was simultaneously personal and universal. It was the cry of a single terrified boy, and it was the cry of generations. Sergeant Miller, who had been moving forward, stopped dead in his tracks. The song, a favorite of his late mother, was a key that unlocked a door in his hardened heart he had long since bolted shut. For a split second, the image of his mother in her church pew, her voice frail but earnest, as she sang, flashed before his eyes. Officer O'Malley froze the handcuffs dangling uselessly from his hand. He looked at Leo, and for the first time he didn't see a suspect or a performer. He saw a child crying for help in the only language he had. The other officers shuffled their feet, their expressions of stern authority, faltering, replaced by confusion, by discomfort, by the first stirrings of shame. The crowd stood completely still, utterly silent. Tears streamed down the face of the woman in the Red Sox cap. The grizzled construction worker wiped at his eyes with the back of a calloused hand. Sarah Chen's grip on her phone tightened her knuckles white. She knew she was capturing something profound, a moment of transcendent, heart-breaking power. Alistair Cromwell closed his eyes. His head bowed. He understood. He finally understood the depth of the passion he had heard earlier. This wasn't just talent. This was survival. Leo played on his eyes, squeezed shut. Tears carving hot tracks through the grime on his cheeks. He wasn't in Quincy Market anymore. He was on his grandfather's porch, the warm summer air, filled with the scent of his grandmother's roses. He was in the hospital room, holding his grandfather's cold, still hand. He was at the funeral home looking at caskets they couldn't afford. He was playing for his grandfather. He was playing for his mother. He was playing for his own small, fragile life. And in that moment, the crowd finally, truly realized who he was playing for. He wasn't playing for them. He wasn't playing for the money or for fame, or even in defiance of the police. He was playing for a soul. The music swelled, a testament to grace, to forgiveness, to a wretched heart being saved. It was a plea, a prayer, a confession, and a eulogy, all woven together by the 4 strings of a battered, priceless violin. As the final heartbreaking note faded into the Boston air, a single collective breath was released. The standoff was over. The battle had been won, not with shouts or with force, but with the devastating, beautiful power of a child's song. The final note of Amazing Grace hung in the air, a shimmering, sacred thing. For a long moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the distant, incongruous cry of a seagull. The city, which had been the hostile backdrop to the drama, was now just a silent witness. Then a single person began to clap. It was the construction worker, his applause slow, deliberate, and respectful. Then another person joined in, and another, until a wave of thunderous applause swept through Quincy Market. It wasn't the applause for a performance. It was an ovation for a survivor. It was a roar of support, of community, of shared humanity. Leo opened his eyes, his vision blurred by tears. He saw the faces in the crowd, no longer a threatening mob, but a sea of empathy. He saw O'Malley slowly, deliberately putting the handcuffs back on his belt. He saw the other officers looking anywhere but at him, their professional composure shattered. And he saw Sergeant Miller. The man's face was a wreck of conflicting emotions. The anger was still there, but it was now warring with a confusion and a shame so profound it seemed to physically pain him. He looked at Leo, then at the crowd, then at Alistair Cromwell, whose gaze was not triumphant, but deeply, sorrowfully disappointed. Without a word, Miller turned on his heel and walked back to his cruiser. His shoulders slumped in a way that had nothing to do with his aching back. Alistair Cromwell stepped forward and gently placed a hand on Leo's shoulder. "It's all right, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's all over." But it wasn't over. It was just beginning. Sarah Chen finally lowered her phone, her finger hovering over the share button. She had nearly 15 minutes of high-definition video capturing everything from the initial confrontation to the final transcendent notes of Amazing Grace. She looked at the raw footage, at the fear in Leo's eyes, the aggression in Miller's, the dawning horror on the faces of the crowd. This was more than just evidence for a potential lawsuit. This was a story that needed to be told. Meanwhile, Ben Carter was already in motion. The cynical journalist who had seen a quick, clickable story had been transformed. The music had shaken him, stripped away his detachment. He saw the human cost the raw injustice. His live tweets had already generated a significant buzz, but the full story, the video that was the key. He approached Sarah, his professional demeanor back in place, but with a new fire in his eyes. "I'm Ben Carter with Boston Digital News," he said, showing her his press credentials. "What you have there, that video, is incredibly important. Can I have your permission to use it? We can get this out there, right now." Sarah, recognizing the power of the platform he offered, nodded immediately. "On one condition," she said, her lawyerly instincts kicking in. "You don't just show the clip. You tell the whole story. You tell them about Alistair Cromwell. You tell them this boy is a scholar, not a criminal. And you have to find out his name," a new voice added. It was the woman in the Red Sox cap. "He deserves to be known for more than this." Ben agreed. He got Sarah's contact information and the video file. He rushed back to his office, a small, cluttered space a few blocks away, his heart pounding with an adrenaline he hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just another story about police overreach. The presence of Cromwell, the scholarship, the gut-wrenching final song it had layers, it had nuance, it had a hero. He worked feverishly, editing the video, writing the accompanying article. He chose his title carefully, wanting to capture the emotional core of the event. He settled on "His violin cried for justice, BPD Sergeant moves to cuff 14-year-old virtuoso until his song silenced a city." He embedded Sarah's video, a raw, unedited window into the confrontation. He detailed every moment: the peaceful crowd, Flannery's aggressive approach, the call for backup, Miller's arrival, Cromwell's intervention and Miller's hostile dismissal of it, and the final soul-stirring performance of Amazing Grace. He included a photo of Alistair Cromwell and a brief bio highlighting his role as a patron of the arts. At 7:14 p.m., just a few hours after the incident, the story went live. The impact was immediate and explosive. It didn't just go viral, it detonated. The link was shared across every social media platform. It was picked up by local news affiliates, then national news outlets. The video, with its potent mix of innocence, injustice, and redemptive music, was irresistible. People didn't just watch it, they felt it. By midnight, Leo Washington and Boston Violin Boy were trending worldwide. The comments sections were a torrent of outrage, sympathy, and heartbreak. People were furious at the police, particularly at Sergeant Miller, whose angry, snarling face became an instant meme for police brutality. They were moved to tears by Leo's playing. They were inspired by Alistair Cromwell's dignified defense. The Boston Police Department's social media pages were flooded. Their phone lines were jammed. The mayor's office was inundated with angry emails. Inside the BPD headquarters, it was chaos. The police commissioner, a man who prided himself on his department's community outreach programs, watched the video in his office, his face growing paler with each passing minute. He saw a PR nightmare of epic proportions. But more than that, he saw a profound failure of his department's values. He slammed his fist on his desk. "Get me the incident report from Quincy Market today," he roared to his aide. "And get me Sergeant Frank Miller's entire service record, now!" The storm had broken. The viral video was the lightning, and now everyone was waiting for the thunder. For Sergeant Miller, the fallout was just beginning. He was at home, his phone buzzing incessantly with calls from his superiors, but he wasn't answering. He was sitting in his darkened living room, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The haunting melody of Amazing Grace, playing over and over in his head, a ghost he couldn't exorcise. The hard karma he had spent a career dishing out was about to come back to him with interest. The morning after the Quincy Market incident was a grim one for the Boston Police Department. The story was on the front page of every newspaper and the lead item on every morning news show. The viral video, now with millions of views, had become a national symbol of racial profiling and the abuse of power. The pressure was immense, and it demanded a swift and decisive response. The commissioner, a political animal who knew the importance of public perception, called an emergency press conference. He stood at a podium flanked by grim-faced deputies and delivered a masterclass in damage control. He announced that Sergeant Frank Miller and Officer Dave Flannery had been placed on administrative leave, effective immediately. He announced a full, transparent internal affairs investigation into the incident. He publicly apologized to Leo Washington and his family, and to Mr. Alistair Cromwell for the profoundly regrettable actions of his officers. The actions witnessed in that video do not reflect the values or the training of the Boston Police Department. The commissioner stated, his face a mask of sincerity. "We are here to serve and protect all members of our community, and that includes nurturing the artistic talents of young people like Mr. Washington, not silencing them." It was a good performance, but behind the scenes a much more serious reckoning was underway. The investigation, spurred by the relentless public outcry and the quiet, immense pressure exerted by Alistair Cromwell and his network, was not going to be a whitewash. The first domino to fall was Officer Flannery. Faced with the undeniable video evidence and the threat of departmental charges, his bravado crumbled. During his interview with Internal Affairs, he placed the blame squarely on Miller. "I was just following the sergeant's lead," he claimed, conveniently omitting his own initial aggressive approach. He was the one who kept escalating. He was the one who wouldn't listen to that Cromwell fella. He was out of control. The focus then shifted entirely to Sergeant Miller. His service record, which the Commissioner had demanded, was pulled. On the surface, it looked exemplary commendations for bravery, a high arrest rate, years of steady service. But when the investigators dug deeper, looking into the citizen complaints file, a darker pattern emerged. Over his 25-year career, Sergeant Miller had accumulated more than a dozen complaints of excessive force verbal abuse and racial profiling. Most had been dismissed due to insufficient evidence or a lack of credible witnesses. They were just one person's word against a decorated officer's. But now, in the blinding light of the viral video, those old complaints were being seen in a new context. They weren't isolated incidents. They were a roadmap of a career defined by aggression and prejudice. The investigators interviewed Officer O'Malley, who, with the backing of his union representative, gave a damningly honest account. He described how the situation was calm until Miller arrived. He detailed Miller's immediate hostility, his refusal to listen to reason, and his shocking dismissal of Alistair Cromwell. He had this look in his eye, O'Malley recalled. It wasn't about the kid anymore. It felt personal. The nail in Miller's coffin came from an unexpected source. The Internal Affairs detectives, doing a thorough background check, stumbled upon the 5-year-old case file of Miller's deceased partner, Jimmy Riley. They read about the incident in Beacon Hill, the tech mogul, and the controversial outcome. They then cross-referenced the names of the mogul's legal team and the influential figures who had publicly supported him. Alistair Cromwell's name was at the top of the list. Suddenly, it all clicked into place. Miller's rage wasn't random. His venomous reaction to Cromwell wasn't just about a general dislike of the rich. It was a specific, festering grudge. He had seen the man he believed helped a cop killer walk free, and he had unleashed 5 years of repressed fury on the nearest available target, a 14-year-old boy. The investigation was no longer just about a procedural violation. It was about a personal vendetta executed under the color of law. This was an abuse of power of the highest order. The hard karma was hitting Frank Miller with the force of a tidal wave. He was suspended without pay. The department, seeking to distance itself from the scandal, leaked the findings of the investigation to Ben Carter. The follow-up story was explosive, detailing Miller's history of complaints and the personal grudge that fueled his actions at Quincy Market. The public shaming was brutal. His name and face were synonymous with everything wrong with modern policing. His fellow officers, once his brothers in blue, now avoided his calls. The career he had built, the identity that had defined his entire adult life, crumbled into dust. He was forced into early retirement, leaving the force not with a hero's pension, but in disgrace. His authority, once absolute, was gone. He was left with nothing but his bitterness and the ghost of a violin song. But the karma didn't stop with Miller. The incident became a catalyst for real change. The BPD, under intense scrutiny, was forced to overhaul its use of force policies and its training for de-escalation and implicit bias. The City Council re-examined its ordinances on public performances, creating a new simplified permit process, specifically for young artists and students. And for Leo, his life was transformed overnight. Alistair Cromwell, moved by the boy's story and horrified by the incident, took Leo and his mother under his wing. He established a new foundation in his grandfather's name, the Marcus Washington Bridge, foundation dedicated to providing instruments and instruction to children in need. Donations poured in from all over the world. Leo's grandfather got the most beautiful funeral imaginable, paid for not by the scattered dollars in a violin case, but by an outpouring of love and support from a city that had taken him into its heart. Leo Washington never had to play on the street for money again. He was invited to perform with the Boston Pops for their 4th of July concert. He played on the stage of Symphony Hall, his battered violin replaced by a magnificent handcrafted instrument, a gift from Cromwell. But as he stood in the spotlight under the warm, brilliant lights, he played with the same raw, honest emotion he had shown in Quincy Market. He played for his mother, for Mr. Cromwell, for the city that had rallied around him. But most of all, he closed his eyes and played for the man who had taught him that music was a bridge. He played for his grandfather, knowing that somewhere, somehow, he was listening. The hard karma had struck down the man who tried to silence him. But for Leo, the justice was not in the punishment of one angry cop. It was in the sweet, soaring sound of his violin, now free to fly. In the end, it wasn't a badge or a fist that won the day, but a song. Leo Washington's story is a powerful reminder that a single voice, a single act of courage can change the world. It shows us that beneath the noise of our daily lives, we are all connected by a shared humanity, a language that music speaks directly to the heart. The hard hand of karma found its mark, but the true victory wasn't in the fall of one man, but in the rise of a community that chose empathy over anger and justice over prejudice. If this story moved you, please give this video a like to show your support. Share it with your friends and family to spread this incredible message of hope and resilience. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more true stories that matter. Thank you for watching.